So thanks for coming to our talk today. This is actually our first time speaking here at Open Source Summit and the CDCDCon, so we're really happy to be here. As we're going through this deck today. We have 20 minutes, so if there isn't time for questions, we'll make sure that we're out in the hallway if there are more questions, if we can get them. So let's get this started. I'm Kadi McKean. I'm a community manager at ReversingLabs. I also do a podcast on the side called 10x Insights. And yeah, I'm here for open source community.
Awesome. And I'm Charlie Jones. I'm a director of product management at ReversingLabs. I am specifically responsible for overseeing our software supply chain security product called Spectre Assure, which is great because that's exactly the sort of subject matter that we'll be covering today. So very excited to unpack this topic and what it means to you all in the open source community.
Yeah. So a little bit about ReversingLabs. We're really good at malware analysis, right? Binary-based malware analysis, but I know we only have 20 minutes, so if you have questions about ReversingLabs, go see us at our booth. We're out by OpenSSF. So this keeps building. I knew that. So the agenda, what is the meat and potatoes we're talking about today? Today we're going to talk about the stakeholders when it comes to the CRA. And we're also going to give you the rules of the road, right? So what are the rules that people need to abide by with this new CRA legislation? And we're also going to talk through key safety, security requirements, as well as proactive safety tips. So raise your hand if you are a manufacturer or vendor of software. Okay, right on. Now, raise your hand if you are a consumer or enterprise buyer of software. All right, we're getting more. Now, raise your hand if you are a contributor or open source maintainer. Awesome. Now, raise your hand if you are a steward.
A lot of hands raised for all of them, which is very cool to see, all the hats you're wearing.
So I love this. Everybody's wearing multiple hats, a little bit like Barbie, right? But for Cyber Resilience Act, requirements and accountability across the software ecosystem, but those responsibilities aren't the same for everyone. So that's why I like to make sure we're talking about the right people and just seeing who we have in the room here today, because the requirements are different. So in terms of manufacturer, we're talking about anybody who is shipping code, right? So, whoopsie. Anyone who is shipping code, and then the enterprise buyer, you know, you're not going to have the same requirements for the CRA like a manufacturer will, but there is things that you do need to be thinking about in the transparency of your software that you're using, right? Open source maintainer or contributor, these are non-commercial products or projects, right? You're not monetizing on them. That's the key here. And then lastly is steward, and this is a little bit more nuanced. So they're typically an organization like a foundation or a non-for-profit that governs or oversees an open source project's direction without directly selling it. So we have some fun examples here, but just wanted to make sure we're all level set on who we're talking about here today.
Cool, I'll take over from there.
Yeah.
Now, one of the misconceptions I wanted to squash today is that all software security standards are the same. The kind of risk management and compliance purist that is deeply rooted in me feels the need to not go a day without correcting people on this notion. So call me overly precise, call me fastidious, but I think it's a very important kind of message to drive home today. So if we continue with this kind of driving analogy that we're talking about today, the rules of the road are going to vary quite a bit when you talk about what is considered a best practice and what is actually a law or otherwise a mandatory requirement that we all as drivers on the road today must actually meet without exception. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we have best practices. You can think of this as kind of getting your oil changed in your car every 5,000 miles. If you go over that number, nothing is going to immediately happen, right? There's no penalty, there's no immediate bodily harm to you or anyone else on the road. But as that drags on towards 10, 15, 20, 25,000 miles, it's undoubtedly going to lead to bad things. Reduced performance, decreased fuel economy, eventually major engine failure. So you as a driver aren't actually obligated to change your oil that frequently, but eventually there will be negative consequences if you don't keep up with that. You can think of the variety of kind of secure development standards, frameworks, or codes of practice that I have listed on this slide on the left in the exact same way. They are proactive controls and activities that you should be following as a software developer to keep yourself and others safe, but no one's overseeing you, right? No one's enforcing you do these things. Now, there's a clear distinction between things that you should do and things that you must do. So that's going to take us to the other end of the spectrum of these hard and fast requirements. Going back to the car analogy, you cannot drink and drive. You can't drive without a seatbelt. You can't drive without a license or insurance. The list goes on. And there are consequences that are enforced by oversight bodies like the police if those requirements are not followed. So you can be fined, you can go to jail, you can have your license revoked. Similarly, in the open market, there are hard and fast obligations. The key here is that there are nuances to these. The easiest way to remember the differences between these are the letters LRM. That stands for legal, regulatory, and mandatory. And there are Fortune and 500 organizations that have entire business units that are dedicated to LRM compliance. Now, I could talk your guys' ear off about this. We only have 20 minutes today, so I'm not going to go into all of it. I will cover go a bit deeper into regulatory as a requirement on the coming slides. But hopefully this gives you a taste of kind of what I call the breadth of external influences that exist within the software supply chain and how they differ in terms of obligation between best practice and hard and fast requirements. Now, that begs the question, what does this mean for all of you that have come here today? Again, it depends on your role in the software supply chain that Katie was talking about. And so for that reason, I wanted to continue our dissection of those roles on the next slide and what they mean for compliance. And rather than just taking my word for it, I've extracted various references from an example regulation, in this case the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, to support those claims, just to give you confidence this isn't just me on my pedestal standing up here telling you these things are important. There's actually a regulatory oversight body in the EU specifically that is saying the same thing. So if you raise your hand as a manufacturer of software or a downstream buyer of software who may use third-party software products to operate critical aspects of your business, tough luck. The majority of requirements are going to fall on your shoulders. We see that in all aspects of the CRA for manufacturers, and then other regulations like DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, for enterprise buyers of software. For open source stewards in the room, although you haven't historically been overseen by regulatory oversight bodies, we now have a new regime in the way of the CRA through their European Commission that does levy requirements against you. That being said, they are very, what we're calling light touch and tailor-made. We'll talk about what that actually means on the next slide. But first, moving on to maintainers, you are broadly exempt from regulatory oversight as long as you are not actually monetarily benefiting from the commercial activity of software you maintain, as Katie referenced before. There are a number of conditions that I understand are still being ironed out by the European Commission. Ultimately, it comes down to, are you taking donations? And are those donations only being used to cover kind of design, development, or provisioning costs of the software that you maintain? And then luckily, to anyone that raised their hand as an individual contributor, take a big sigh of relief. CRA text says very clearly that you are exempt from the requirements that are outlined in the CRA. Now, I may say, irrespective of whatever hat that you wear, I am very confident that the overall impact of regulations like the CRA are going to be net positive. And that's because, contrary to popular belief, the aim by regulators isn't to stifle innovation, it isn't to add compliance and red tape. It's ultimately to protect the consumer by uplifting the security posture of software across the board, specifically in Europe in the CRA's case. And yes, a lot of these obligations do fall on the shoulders of the manufacturer, but the truth is the large majority of commercial software that is shipped by a manufacturer is made up of open source code. And that I don't see that changing as a result of this regulation. I only expect more involvement, more collaboration, and more general support for the open source community, specifically from the private sector, who is now heavily incentivized to make sure that open source software that they use in their products and that they ship to the open market is actually secure. Now, because we see this fundamental shift in emerging requirements for open source stewards, I wanted to take a second to double click on what these actually entail. Because yes, the bad news is you now have hard and fast obligations that are codified into regulatory text. The good news is that the bar you are being held to is very low, especially when in comparison to actual manufacturers of software. So to put it into perspective, Article 24 of the CRA, which outlines the obligations of open source stewards, only makes up 3 paragraphs of an otherwise 81-page regulatory text. And again, I have to reiterate, I am not a public policy professional or a lawyer, so take this with a grain of salt, but I did want to use my audit and risk background to help kind of translate these requirements in a much simpler language for you. So I did my best to put these into layman's terms and outline what do these 3 paragraphs in the CRA, in Article 24 specifically, say that you must do as an open source steward. So first and foremost, write a policy, a Word document, right, that describes your processes for secure development and vulnerability handling. I don't want to overcomplicate this because this is relatively basic. It doesn't say you need to follow best practice. It doesn't say you need to be SALSA level 3 compliant. You just have to have a document and make sure that the vulnerability handling section of that document captures these basic principles. How do you identify and document vulnerabilities? How are you addressing and remediating those vulnerabilities once identified? And then finally, how do you report and share those vulnerabilities with relevant stakeholders? Second thing you need to do is simply cooperate. Make sure you work with your local regulator. What does that mean? They call out a few examples in the actual text of the regulation. It could be something as simple as taking that policy document you just created and translating it into a language that the regulator understands. Or it could be something more broad, like supporting the mitigation of a specific open source risk that may be identified in a project you support. And then finally, in the event that certain criteria are met, an example that's given in the text is a critical severity incident is detected in a system that the steward provides to support the development of a product. Only then would you be required to assist in reporting that incident or vulnerability at a national level to whoever the designated CSIRT is, at a union level to ANISA, or possibly to the impacted users of the product. And again, in these edge case scenarios, you could be required to actually provide guidance on how to correct or mitigate a specific risk or incident that's found. So again, have a policy, cooperate with authorities when required, and then assist in reporting and mitigation in these certain edge case scenarios. So in summary, a very lightweight set of requirements that are now yours to own as open source stewards.
So let's talk about proactive safety tips, right? I think it depends a lot on the lens that you're looking at it based on the role that you have, whether you're one of those 4 different people that we talked about in the beginning, right? Manufacturer, contributor, buyer, or a steward. So it depends on that lens, and from there you can think of things like, should you get your headlights checked? You can scan for secrets, right? Or maybe you should use your turn signal, which could be make sure you have clear commits or SBOMs for downstream consumers. Or check your oil regularly, or regularly assess your dependencies, right? These are things you could be doing to proactively bolster your security. Or maybe even enroll in defensive driving or embrace the DevSecOps culture. So here we put down some fast, hardcore proactive safety tips for folks when they're looking based off what role that you are. So, I think the key thing that we really wanted to make sure people take away today is that between manufacturers and the consumers, having and maintaining that audit trail, I think is going to be really key. So you're kind of combining the 2 groups who are most regulated, but having that transparency and audit trail is only going to help you further downstream or when someone does come to inspect the code, right? We also talked about VEX, and this has a direct relationship between the 2 as they're constantly communicating and collaborating. So VEX is incredible with information sharing between multiple different parties, between consumer, maintainer, or even the other direction. So it's a great example of one of the ways you can achieve some of these regulatory obligations and share vulnerability disclosures. It's also strictly about exploitability. So VEX downstream provides automation to customers, right? And it also massively reduces the amount of manual triage time that you might have to do today. So I think we're about at time, I'm pretty sure. So I just want to make sure we leave, okay, well, 5, perfect. Other things that, for contributors and maintainers, we've talked about manufacturers and buyers, but for contributors and maintainers, make sure you're following secure coding practices. So SALSA is a good framework that Charlie mentioned. Input validation, dependency hygiene, and making sure you have those reproducible builds. So just be thoughtful about the dependencies you bring in. That's a big thing that we help out with too. So if you want to talk about it, come find us at the booth. And if possible, my other suggestion would be join communities that are working on secure tools and guidance. So join things like OpenSSF, where they can give you those best practices that maybe you need guidance on. And I think lastly, for stewards, you may not be on the hook for compliance directly, but you're in a unique position to raise the bar. So what have you got to lose, right? Provide security guidance and templates for projects under your umbrella. Help define what secure development is. What does that look like in your ecosystem, and what does the support for maintainers meeting those goals look like? How are you incentivizing them to follow these best practices? Also facilitating conversations between legal and compliance expert is, doesn't sound like my idea of a good time, but it is something that needs to be done, right? So you're preparing your projects and communities for downstream adoption. So having those conversations early will help you in the long run. And lastly, I'm a big fan for advocate for tooling education and funding for the security work. It's often the missing piece that I think we really, as individual contributors, need to start doing a better job of, is sharing those and educating people on it. So what does the road ahead look like, right? You can go any different direction. You can be your own destiny, right? So the road ahead for us is, I think Charlie talked a little bit about security attestation. And the idea behind this is because maintainers, it's free and, free open source software. I have to make sure I'm using the exact terminology here to be careful. It's free of obligation from CRA as a result, doesn't need to achieve some of these, markings like security often needs. But creating the concept of security attestation would allow a maintainer that's not obligated by the CRA to still support manufacturers in some way. So down here, what you're looking at is, Charlie loves legal language, so this is why it's here. But this is Article 13.5 for manufacturers. So you now have to go out and get the security attestation. So AKA, it's safe to use as said by CRA. So there's no formal process for manufacturers to do this, but you can do it voluntarily. And if you do want to be helpful and engage members of the community, this is a great way of demonstrating your commitment to security downstream for your users. So I think, nope. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yep, back over there. Let me get you.
Perfect, yeah. You looked like you had a good jog.
Yeah, so I'm interested in hearing more about the carve out for FOSS maintainers and how, hey, like as long as the project isn't involved in commercial or monetary activity, they're exempt. I think like we've certainly heard in like other talks and like in the air that one of the things that the industry is trying to figure out how to do is how can we pay these maintainers for the work that they're doing so that we can help improve security elsewhere. On its face, it sounds like if we do that, now they are in scope. And I don't know if I'm a maintainer and my hobby is now potentially something that's going to make me legally liable. I might not want to get paid and might just go fishing instead. How do we feel about that?
It's a really good question. So as I understand it, the thresholds for what qualifies as coming into scope as a maintainer are still yet to be defined by the European Commission, and that's still something that's being ironed out. I think, to my point previously, there are scenarios where you should be able to take contributions as a maintainer, as long as those contributions are limited in some aspect, either in how they're used or some monetary value of some sort. So that, I don't think that level of minutia has actually been defined yet in how it will be enforced. But the idea is maintainers should be broadly exempt. Of course, there are certain scenarios where I'm sure if you're pushing the boundary of how much money you're taking and what forms that you're taking it, what the money is being, the capital is actually being allocated and used for, you should be careful around that until it is hard and fast defined. So I don't think there's a perfect answer to that yet, and what can be contributed, what you can and can't take. But I think that's still being defined, just to make sure that, like, again, I think the regulatory oversight bodies know that there are complexities in these systems, and not every situation is the same. So I wish I had a better answer, a silver bullet for you, but I think that's still being worked on.